Over the years, numerous individuals have asserted that they survived the massacre at Little Bighorn, where George Armstrong Custer met his end. While most of these tales veered into the realm of fiction, Frank Finkel's story stood apart because it was genuine. Between 1876 and the 1920s, roughly 70 elderly men recounted their daring escapes from the massacre to historians and journalists, each weaving dramatic tales of survival. Their narratives often followed familiar themes, disguising themselves by wrapping in blankets to blend with Native Americans, hiding within the hollowed carcass of a horse or buffalo, or being rescued by a chief's daughter who had fallen for them. However, unlike these fabricated accounts, Finkel's story was different, not only because of its distinctiveness, but also due to historical records that had been overlooked in archives for decades. Until recently, the final pieces of evidence confirming Frank Finkel's identity as a genuine survivor of the Battle of the Little Bighorn had remained hidden within the National Archives, the U.S. Census Bureau, and the Columbia County Auditor's Office in Dayton, Washington. By combining these records with published accounts, it became clear that Finkel was exactly who he claimed to be, the only confirmed white survivor from the 5 companies that followed Custer into battle near the Little Bighorn River on June 25, 1876. In 1868, when Frank was just 14, his father passed away. The small farm was inadequate for supporting all 6 of Peter Finkel's sons, so some of the older boys, including Frank, set off in search of work elsewhere. By January 1872, down on his luck in Chicago and facing limited prospects, Frank Finkel did what many young men in his position did. He enlisted in the U.S. Army. For native-born Americans like Finkel, joining the Army was often seen as an admission of economic failure. Many men who enlisted used fake names, and Frank was no exception. But he didn't simply choose a random alias. He crafted one that would elevate his status and potentially open doors to promotions. Finkel chose to adopt the name August Finkel, further Germanizing his identity by claiming his birthplace as Berlin, Prussia. He also listed his previous occupation as a clerk. At that time, Prussian soldiers were highly regarded, thanks to Prussia's recent military victories. Frank likely capitalized on this reputation to gain favor with his superiors and peers. He kept his real birth date, January 23rd, but updated his age from 18 to 27, quickly earning the trust of those around him. By telling gullible members of the 5th and later the 7th Cavalry, including his German-born friend Charles Windolf, that he had been a Prussian officer, Frank enhanced his credibility even more. Physically, Finkel was an imposing figure. Standing just over 6 feet tall with dark hair, gray eyes, and a strong build, he stood out among his peers. His size, combined with his language skills, helped him rise through the ranks quickly. Within 2 years of enlisting, he had already been promoted to the rank of sergeant. By 1876, Finkel was serving as the 2nd sergeant in C Company of the 7th Cavalry, a unit commanded by Captain Tom Custer, George Armstrong Custer's brother. C Company was known for its high morale, and its soldiers were fiercely loyal to the Custer brothers. This loyalty extended to personal style. When the Army issued the soldiers large floppy hats that made them look like pirates, the men of C Company pooled their money to buy more fashionable hats from a retailer in Chicago. This seemingly minor incident led to a confrontation between George Custer and the Army's post trader, who chastised him for buying goods off post. The monopoly on post traderships was notorious at the time, as many traders were businessmen who rarely, if ever, visited the Army posts they profited from. These traders often inflated prices on goods, such as whiskey and canned peaches, and kept a percentage of the profits for themselves. Meanwhile, supplies meant for Native Americans often disappeared, leaving them with little but a steady stream of 16-shot Henry repeating rifles, which were deemed surplus after the introduction of newer models. The Sioux refused to sell the Black Hills in 1875, leading many younger men to join the so-called Sitting Bull Sioux, Hunkpapa, and other tribes deemed hostile by the U.S. Army officers, however, referred to them as self-supporters because they lived off the land. George Custer, who had recently testified before Congress about corruption in the post-trading system, found himself in hot water in Washington, D.C., and had to work hard to regain a command role in the upcoming campaign against the Sioux. The 7th Cavalry, including Tom Custer's C Company and 2nd Sergeant Frank Finkel, set out from Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory as part of a three-pronged offensive against the Sioux and their allies. But as the cavalry approached the Little Bighorn River, George Custer refused additional firepower, turning down 3 Gatling guns, a 3-inch Rodman cannon, and 2 companies from the 2nd Cavalry, his former Civil War regiment. While George Custer seemed confident, C Company wasn't so sure. Rumors swirled that Captain Tom Custer was unusually nervous before the battle, and Lieutenant H.M. Harrington, second in command of C Company, was plagued by nightmares of being tied to a tree and tortured by Native Americans. First Sergeant Edwin Bobo was so anxious that he ordered a small .22 caliber pistol by mail, but he forgot to bring it to the battle. As the men rode closer to the Little Bighorn, they stumbled upon a gruesome sight: a white man's scalp mounted on a stick, an ominous prelude to the horrors they would soon face. Tensions were high as C Company approached the river on June 25, 1876. The sight of the massive native encampment, larger than any the soldiers had ever seen, did nothing to calm their nerves. C Company led the charge down to the Little Bighorn River, but Finkel's horse struggled to keep up. At 6 feet tall and heavily built, Finkel was the tallest and one of the heaviest men in the 7th Cavalry, and his horse was having trouble bearing the load. Sergeant Daniel Canepe later recounted the moment in 1924. "I was riding close to Sergeant Finkel. We were both close to Cap. Tom Custer." Finkel hollered at me that he couldn't make it. His horse was giving out. I answered back, "Come on, Finkel, if you can." He dropped back a bit. Canepe, the second-to-last man to see the Custer brothers alive, was soon ordered back to speed up the ammunition pack train. He left Finkel and his struggling horse to follow the rest of C Company down to the river. At least 4 troopers from C Company fell behind with horse troubles, but Finkel continued with the group as they reached the stream. The exact events of the battle have been the subject of endless debate. However, based on the archaeological findings of Richard Allen Fox Jr., it appears that George Custer initially stopped at the river before pulling his men back to take up 3 defensive positions. C Company, under Tom Custer's command, was stationed on Calhoun Hill, which overlooked the Hunkpapa village. Meanwhile, Major Marcus Reno led an assault on the other side of the encampment. Reno's forces were quickly repelled, and native warriors, armed with superior rifles, poured out of the camp. The soldiers of the 7th Cavalry, armed with single-shot Springfield carbines, found themselves outgunned. Finkel later recalled that as C Company took up positions on the hill, the order came to mount. Just as Finkel was firing, a bullet struck the butt of his carbine, slamming the steel barrel into his forehead. He was knocked unconscious and hit twice more, once in the leg and once in the side. His horse was also injured, with its bridle cut by a bullet and its flank grazed. In the ensuing chaos, as warriors charged uphill to defend their families, Finkel's wounded horse bolted. Along with a few surviving troopers from C Company, Finkel was carried through the attacking native forces and down Calhoun Hill, beyond the Hunkpapa camp, and out onto the plains. Later, Rain in the Face, a respected Hunkpapa Sioux warrior, told W. Kent Thomas in 1894, "One long sword escaped. His pony ran off with him and went past our lodges at the foot of Calhoun Hill. I remembered hearing the squaws tell about it after the fight." Finkel wasn't the only one who managed to break through the native lines, but he was one of the few who survived. Lieutenant Harrington's body was never recovered, and though a skeleton found years later may have been his, there is no definitive proof. Corporal John Foley of C Company also made it out of the encirclement, but he was chased by 3 young native warriors armed only with bows. When Foley ran out of ammunition and in a panic shot himself with his Colt .45. Some historians believe that as many as 8 men from C Company may have initially escaped, only to be hunted down and killed far from the battlefield. In later years, Crow Indian scouts found 6 skeletons with 7th Cavalry gear, but the Army never conducted an official investigation. One soldier, Trooper Nathan Short, managed to ride 20 miles to the Rosebud River before he and his horse collapsed and died. Back on Calhoun Hill, Sergeant Jeremiah Finley, an Irish-born Civil War veteran and friend of Finkel, was unhorsed and killed. First Sergeant Bobo, whose horse was also killed, walked back toward Custer Hill, where he died during the final stand. Tom Custer, along with his brothers George and Boston, nephew Audie Reed, and brother-in-law Lieutenant James Calhoun, also perished. As the battle raged, Finkel kept riding, barely conscious and severely injured. Over the next day and night, he crossed the 3 branches of Tulloch's Creek. He later reported that the southern branches were polluted with alkali, but the northernmost branch had fresh water, a detail later confirmed by Dr. Charles Kuhlman, a topographer who studied the region. Days after the battle, Finkel reached the confluence of the Rosebud and Yellowstone rivers, where he was forced to put his dying horse down with a single shot. In August 1876, Lieutenant Edward Godfrey of the 7th Cavalry found the horse's remains and realized that there had been a survivor. However, he did not report that the horse was a C Company sorrel until 1921, and the story did not appear in print until the 1950s. Back at the battlefield, Sergeant Canepe discovered Finley's mutilated body, with 12 arrows in it. "I looked over the dead and recognized here and there a buddy and a sergeant that I knew," he said. "I recognized Sergeants Finkel and Finley. Sergeant Finley lay at his horse's head. He had 12 arrows through him. They had been lying there for 2 days in the sun, bloody and the wounded mutilated. The squaws would always, after taking the clothes off the men, shoot them full of arrows or chop them in the faces with tomahawks." However, Canepe never found Finkel's horse, and while he claimed to have seen Finkel's body, he never explained how he could identify a corpse that had been lying in the heat for 2 days. Sergeant Charles Windolph, Finkel's best friend, returned to the battlefield after the fighting to search for Finkel's body, but was unable to find it. Wandering through the wilderness, Finkel eventually encountered a white man chopping wood outside a shack in territory. Startled by the sight of a soldier, the man initially raised his gun and ordered Finkel away. Finkel, however, collapsed, and the man relented, helping him inside the cabin where another white man lay dying of tuberculosis. These 2 men, one of whom was named Bill, took turns caring for Finkel. Using primitive medical techniques, they probed his leg wound with a pine splinter before cauterizing it with hot pitch. Finkel passed out from the pain, but when he woke, the bleeding had stopped and his wounds began to heal. For the next few weeks, Finkel helped Bill care for the dying man until he finally passed away. After burying him with a simple marker, Finkel and Bill parted ways. Finkel eventually made his way back to civilization, where he discovered that his entire company had been wiped out at Little Bighorn. His name appeared near the bottom of the casualty list, printed on the front page of the Bismarck Tribune. Now officially dead, Finkel may have decided that he had had enough of the army and chose to remain hidden. For about a year he drifted through St. Louis, working in the dairy business before moving to California. There, he discovered the small town of Dayton, Washington, where he decided to settle. With his skills in carpentry and farming, Finkel began buying land, building successful farms, and selling them for profit. In 1886, near his birthday, Finkel married Delia Rainwater, the daughter of Jacob Rainwater, one of the wealthiest and most respected men in Dayton. Finkel signed the marriage certificate as Finkel, but signed the marriage license as Finkel. On their wedding night, Delia asked about the old gunshot wound on his left side. Finkel told her that he had been shot during a fight with some Native Americans, but didn't say where the battle had taken place. The bullet in his side eventually worked its way to the surface, and Finkel had a surgeon remove it. Throughout the 1890s, Finkel continued to buy and sell farms in Dayton. Over the years, he gradually transitioned from signing his name as Finkel to Finkel. By 1920, he and Delia had 4 children, 3 of whom lived to adulthood, including their son Ben, who went on to serve multiple terms in the Idaho legislature. The family became well known and respected in the Dayton community. In April 1920, during a casual game of horseshoes, Frank Finkel unexpectedly revealed his status as a survivor of Custer's last stand. Another farmer had made a remark about Custer being ambushed by Native Americans, prompting Finkel to respond, "You don't know what the hell you're talking about." When the neighbor asked how he knew so much, Finkel replied, "I was there." Word of Finkel's claim quickly spread, and he was invited to speak at the Dayton Kiwanis Club. After his neighbors hired a carpenter to finish a porch that Finkel had been working on, he agreed to tell his story. An article summarizing Finkel's account appeared in the April 8, 1920 issue of the local newspaper. Dayton, April 8th. Frank Finkel, a pioneer resident of Columbia County, was the chief speaker at the Thursday luncheon of the Dayton Kiwanis Club this week. He was an eyewitness to the Custer massacre and gave to the club the account of his thrilling escape and the circumstances that prevented the knowledge of his survival from reaching the government at the time. Congressman John W. Summers of Walla Walla was a guest at the luncheon, and he will make an effort to get government recognition of Mr. Finkel's story. In giving the account of the battle in which General Custer's command was pocketed by the Indian forces, Finkel said his horse became Kettler and bolted through the Indian lines, carrying him to a territory beyond the fighting. He had 2 serious bullet wounds, and after many days of wandering, he found a cabin in the wilderness where he was months recovering from his injuries. The term Kettler was an error. Finkel had used the Civil War slang skedaddled to describe his panicked flight from the battlefield. However, Finkel's frank and detailed account left no doubt in the minds of those who knew him that he had been present at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Yet despite his credibility, Finkel made one additional false claim that would complicate his story for future generations. While he had initially admitted that his name was on the casualty list as August Finkel, by the time his story reached a wider audience, Finkel had begun to distance himself from that alias. He claimed that a house fire had destroyed his military papers, which might have confirmed his identity. In the years following World War I, as anti-German sentiment ran high in the United States, Finkel's second wife, Hermie, appears to have become even more nervous about his connection to Germany. When Hermie attempted to secure a military pension for Finkel after his death, she claimed that he had enlisted under the name Frank Hall, a man who had deserted the 7th Cavalry in 1875, a year before the battle. This confusion over names further muddled the historical record. On June 25, 1921, the 45th anniversary of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Frank Finkel was once again interviewed by the press. In one of his final public statements, Finkel recounted his version of the battle. The battle opened with an attack on an Indian village. General Custer led one set of troops, while Major Marcus Reno headed another. Custer's forces rode on to the attack until suddenly there was a thunder of yells as the Indians sprang from behind every bush and poured over the hilltops. Men and horses went down all around me. A bullet hit my rifle stock, and a splinter of steel started blood flowing between my eyes. My horse bolted and carried me, half-blinded, through the Indian lines. Then came a stinging sensation in my shoulder, and I lost consciousness, falling forward on my horse. When I came to, it was dark. Early the next morning, I reached the mountains. For 5 days I rode, eating raw rabbits in fear of attracting the Indians if I built a fire. On the 6th day, I met some trappers and stayed with them until September. Frank's wife Delia died in August 1921 after a brief illness. Her obituary noted, her husband, who survived her, was the only soldier who escaped the Custer massacre. In 1926, 5 years after Delia's death, Finkel married Hermie, a Canadian-born Anglo-Saxon woman who adored him but knew little about his military past. Frank himself died in August 1930 at the age of 76, having lived a long and prosperous life as a respected citizen of Dayton. Despite his wealth, Hermie still pursued a pension on his behalf, attempting to prove his status as a Custer survivor. Hermie's efforts to establish Finkel's legacy continued until her own death in 1951. However, she mistakenly claimed that Finkel had enlisted under the name Frank Hall, adding to the confusion about his true identity. She also denied that Finkel and Finkel were the same person, despite clear evidence to the contrary. Hermie likely never knew that Lieutenant Edward Godfrey had found a dead horse matching the description of Finkel's C Company sorrel back in August 1876, a piece of evidence that further supports Finkel's survival. In the years since Frank Finkel's death, historians and researchers have continued to debate his story. Some accounts suggest that Finkel was given the opportunity to meet Sergeant Charles Windolph, a fellow survivor of the 7th Cavalry, who had earned the Medal of Honor for his actions on Reno Hill, but that Finkel backed out. However, this is untrue. Windolph didn't learn of Finkel's survival until long after his friend had died, but when he did, he expressed regret that they hadn't reconnected, calling Finkel a gallant soldier. Finkel's account of the battle was not the romanticized version of Custer's last stand that was popularized in the years following the event. Instead, it was a gritty and realistic portrayal of a rout where C Company was broken up and scattered across the battlefield. As modern research has shown, Finkel's description aligns closely with the archaeological evidence and the testimony of other survivors and native warriors. Although Hermie's attempts to secure Finkel's pension were ultimately unsuccessful, Frank Finkel remains one of the few verified survivors of Custer's last stand.